Hey guys, it's Drake, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite books, and one of my favorite authors. This is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. But unfortunately, I'm not just going to be talking about it out of joy or enjoyment or appreciation. It's going to mostly be out of a sense of a moral obligation, out of respect for the author and of literature in general. And unfortunately, I had to make one of these videos before, and I really don't enjoy making these, but as you'll see of the topic of this video, I do feel a moral obligation to do that. So to set the stage a little bit, since this is one of my favorite books, one of my favorite writers, I periodically look up other people's opinions of it, just to see if I can learn anything, which unfortunately I rarely do. One thing I am looking forward to, though, is the Cormac McCarthy podcast that has just recently been made in the last year. Currently, they're making videos or recordings on Suttree, which they're going chronologically, so then Blood Meridian will be next. I am looking forward to seeing what they put up there. The only valuable book that I've found that talks about Blood Meridian is Notes on Blood Meridian by John Seepich, whom he mostly goes into the historical context and the historical sources that McCarthy would have used, most notably being My Confession by Samuel Chamberlain. So that's the context of how I unfortunately stumbled upon some functionally illiterate redneck neo-Nazis enjoying Blood Meridian and using it almost as what would be the right way of saying it? As an example of their beliefs. And so I found these. It's specifically two people. I'm not going to mention their names here because I really wouldn't want them to get any more traction than they otherwise would. But if you want to find them, you can. It really wouldn't be too hard. They're on YouTube, and they do have strikingly misguided and, from my view, reprehensible beliefs. So I felt it necessary to at least respond to their general argument. Not really respond, but totally separately from their existence. Make several points about Blood Meridian that are incontestable. Okay, so to summarize briefly what they believe that they see in Blood Meridian. So basically what they believe is that that McCarthy is defending a view that would have been relatively prevalent in America in the late 1840s and early 1850s, when the majority of this book takes place, which would be a view of racial essentialism in the context of the book, that white Europeans and their culture and their genetics are categorically superior to other groups, specifically in this case Mexican people and native people of the United States and Mexico, because that's where this takes place. And their main evidence of this is from quotations of Judge Holden, which I've always taken it as a warning sign if you agree too much with anything Judge Holden says. That if you agree with what he says, you should take a second and look back at what you think and truly evaluate it deeply and see if is what you actually want to believe, for obvious reasons. I mean, Judge Holden in Blood Meridian murders children, drowns puppies, enables slaughter, destroys artifacts. And I think you can think of some contemporary political groups that do this same thing. And they are generally viewed as enemies of civilization. But I think an interesting twist McCarthy throws into it is that Judge Holden is apparently civilized. And I use the word apparently, or I highlight the word apparently there. So they find quotes like "war is God," and they unironically quote those as being justifiable or good in some way, or even as a realistic description of reality, if not, good or bad, maybe just a description. And they find particular situations where a specific character of whatever particular race that they contemporarily categorize them as being a redneck neo-Nazi, which oddly enough exactly tracks to how a racist person in 1850 would view these particular groups, which I think says something important about their beliefs today. But they will take that viewpoint as if it is unselfconsciously presented in the book, Blood Meridian, which isn't even defensible in the book itself, but it's vastly less defensible if you read McCarthy's complete work. And I know, McCarthy gets these idiotic the descriptors put on him, dude, bro, lit, and all this stuff. People who say things like that, they might as well stop reading, because if you read the trajectory of the Bible, Paradise Lost, Moby Dick, Blood Meridian, and you think that somehow Blood Meridian is an outlier in those groups, you're objectively wrong. So I'm not going to make this whole video a defense of that, but that's on the other side, apart from these these neo-Nazi types. So I am going to mention a specific passage that unfortunately is trivialized to the extent of almost meaninglessness, but I think is one of the most important passages in the book. I'm just going to read it and give my interpretation, with giving no justification to an alternate redneck neo-Nazi interpretation. So the specific passage I'm going to read and then talk about is, if you have this edition, the 25th anniversary edition is on page 322. If you don't have that, it is in the second to last chapter, right before it was the 1878, and it's about 6 pages from the end of that second to last chapter, chapter 12. So, chapter 22, excuse me. All right, and then, so yeah, I'm just going to read it real quick, and then I'll discuss what I think about it, and then connect it to another book I've been reading. All right, so the context of this is the kid has been in surgery, and he's currently healing, but I think he has some sort of infection, and he's like hidden away in a back room. The curtains are drawn, he's hidden away. And he starts to either imagine the judge, or the judge enters in his, alchemical and magical way, sinister way. In that sleep, and in sleeps to follow, the judge did visit. Who would come other? A great shambling mutant, silent and serene. Whatever his antecedents, he was something wholly other than their sum, nor was there system by which to divide him back into his origins, for he would not go. Whoever would seek out his history through that unraveling of loins and ledger books must stand at last darkened and dumb at the shore of a void without terminus or origin, and whatever science he might bring to bear upon the dusty primal matter blowing down out of the millennia will discover no trace of any ultimate atavistic egg by which to reckon his commencing. In the white and empty room he stood in his bespoken suit, with his hat in his hand, and he peered down with his small and lashless pig's eyes, wherein this child, just 16 years on earth, could read whole bodies of decisions not accountable to the courts of men. And he saw his own name, which nowhere else could he have ciphered out, at all logged into the records as a thing already accomplished. A traveler known in jurisdictions existing only in the claims of certain pensioners or on old dated maps. In his delirium he ransacked the linens of his pallet for arms, but there were none. The judge smiled. The fool was no longer there, but another man, and this other man he could never see in his entirety, but he seemed an artisan and a worker in metal. The judge enshadowed him where he crouched at his trade, but he was a cold forger who worked with hammer and die, perhaps under some indictment and an exile from men's fires, hammering out, like his own conjectural destiny, all through the night of his becoming, some coinage for a dawn that would not be. It is this false moneyer with his gravers and burins who seeks favor with the judge, and he is at contriving from old slag brute in the crucible a face that will pass, an image that will render this residual species current in the markets where men barter. Of this is the judge, and the night does not end. And that's a connection to an earlier passage where the kid asks, what's he a judge of? And then he just gets, kind of laughed at or dismissed. And then we hear at this point, of this is the judge, and the night does not end. So when I read that passage, I think the thing that is most striking to me is that partially what is being written is that the origins of what the judge represents are so old it is impossible to find their origins. And that goes back to one of the epigraphs at the beginning, the Yuma Daily Sun, June 13th, 1982. Clark, who led last year's expedition to the Afar region of northern Ethiopia, and UC Berkeley colleague Tim D. White, also said that a re-examination of a 300,000-year-old fossil skull found in the same region earlier showed evidence of having been scalped. So that is what I think is partially going on in this first paragraph that I read. We'll discover no trace of any ultimate atavistic egg by which to reckon his commencing. And in this case, his is the judge, and the judge is an archetypal or allegorical figure to represent what I'm going to talk about next. Of this is the judge, and the night does not end. So then what is the judge in this case? So what I think, after reading the book and looking at this passage for a couple weeks now, or in a more focused way, I think that the judge is a conduit of power. And in this specific case, this person, this false moneyer, which is itself, I think, an allegorical figure, of course. This false moneyer is at contriving from cold slag brute in the crucible a face that will pass, an image that will render this residual species current in the markets where men barter. So really what this false moneyer is contriving is not the money itself. He is at contriving the system, and more specifically, the institutions that allow this money to have value and, more meaningfully, force behind it. And I do think that is basically correct, is that the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief. So to be in charge of the country, you are in charge of the military. But unfortunately, the military is not the only power you have in a country anymore. It used to be really the majority of the power, I think. But in our current system, where you can have an asset manager with $10 trillion of assets under management, and it would be trivial to destroy a country with that much money, to create a country, to have a standing army, to pay for assassinations, to pay for espionage and mass theft and enforced homelessness and things, among many others. With that amount of money, which, in the end is not under the control of the government specifically, because many, just as a specific example, these multinational corporations are in many ways beyond governments or superior to governments. And it takes a trivial amount of money to capture a politician, especially when you consider that, $10 trillion would be under management on some of the larger asset management funds. But that's a specific example of something other than what is being mentioned here, because this idea of the false moneyer, that could of course go back to when Julius Caesar, who was one of the first people he was the first Roman to put his actual face as himself on a coin. And of course, he got his power by being a general, which, he also became wealthy. But the reason he became wealthy was because he stole a lot of money and resources from other people that were inferior militarily. And in the context of this book, that takes place in the late 1840s, which is after the end of the Mexican-American War, which is, although it's not a small list, it's probably one of the least defensible wars America has committed, using, some ridiculous justification to go in to beat a weaker power and take half of its land, and which augments your own land by 1/3, and then of course never giving it back, and just saying like, oh well, it happened in the past, deal with it, just deal with it, it happened already. And that's just like a specific kind of nation state example. But of course, we have the system that set up the mass genocide of Indians or Native Americans. And, you know, I thought about this a lot, and I do think it is fair to, it's definitely fair to consider what happened to Indians a mass genocide, especially in the context of, you know, the stuff that's coming out in Canada now with the residential schools, which of course was being done in the United States. I just think it's being hidden a little better, or maybe it didn't last quite long enough for it to be really widely known, where you can't interview people who went through it. As far as the genocide of culture, but also the genocide of people. And I want to bring in another book that I'm currently reading, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, An Indian History of the American West, which was published 1970. So McCarthy would have definitely read it. And one formal characteristic that connects Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee with Blood Meridian is the repetitive and almost monotonous violence that you see. And that's something that I think really is noticeable in Blood Meridian. And of course it's intentional, that the traveling is monotonous and repetitive. The violence is monotonous and repetitive. You almost forget who was killed when, because you have the same scenarios replaying themselves over and over. The Indians slaughter a large group of Europeans. The Europeans slaughter a large group of Indians. The filibusters scalp a random village that never did anything wrong to anybody. And then the villagers get some military group to go chase after the filibusters, and then the military group gets waylaid by some Indians, and then the filibusters, you know, go get some more scalps, or, you know, in this sort of method. And it's just never ending. You see this over and over, and it starts from the beginning of the book, mindless violence, you know, this sense of mindless violence, and continues all the way through to the very end. And one passage I want to read from this book that I think is compelling as far as an influence for McCarthy, if not specifically an influence, generally an influence, the type of person is an influence, is from page 30 of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And to set it up, we're looking at the Navajo Indians here. The Long Walk of the Navajos is the chapter title. And right now we're looking at the Navajos being chased around and exiled from their homeland, and they're trying to get them to be put in a reservation so that they can be even more enfeebled and forgotten about, and, you know, from the perspective of the United States, hopefully just die off gradually so you don't have to deal with them anymore. And to put some language behind that, you have Star Chief Carleton, who is an officer in the U.S. military who is put in charge of capturing the Navajo Indians and striking a peace treaty with them so that they can be effectively victims of genocide. So here we have start. In the eyes of the Star Chief Carleton, his prisoners were only mouths and bodies. These 6,000 mouths must eat, and these 6,000 bodies must be clothed. When it is considered what a magnificent pastoral and mineral country they have surrendered to us, a country whose value can hardly be estimated, the mere pittance in comparison, which must at once be given to support them, sinks into insignificance as a price for their natural heritage. And no advocate of manifest destiny ever phrased his support of that philosophy more unctuously than he. This is the Star Chief. The exodus of this whole people from the land of their fathers is not only an interesting but a touching sight. They have fought us gallantly for years on years. They have defended their mountains and their stupendous canyons with a heroism which any people might be proud to emulate. But when, at length, they found it was their destiny, too, as it had been that of their brethren, tribe after tribe, away back toward the rising of the sun, or the setting of the sun, to give way to the insatiable progress of our race, they threw down their arms, and as brave men, entitled to our admiration and respect, have come to us with confidence in our magnanimity, and feeling that we are too powerful and too just a people to repay that confidence with meanness or neglect. Feeling that having sacrificed to us their beautiful country, their homes, the associations of their lives, the scenes rendered classic in their traditions, we will not dole out to them a miser's pittance in return for what they know to be and what we know to be a princely realm. And then it continues to show that, in 1865, this struggle continued. But I see in that speech certainly the same falseness that you have with the speeches of the judge, which I think if you agreed with anything you heard in there, which almost certainly many Americans would agree with in that time in 1865. Many Americans who today don't agree with that, if they were transplanted, in the same circumstances back in 1865, they would certainly believe that. I think in the same way that speech is touching and logical and shows some false humility, you have speeches of the judge that are some of them are touching about the Anasazi Indians, the old people, or the conversation he has about education with putting children in cages with wolves, that idea, which I can imagine some people would agree with. Or the war is God speech, that war is inevitable, therefore it is compelling, and therefore it is justified, and this sort of idea. Because of course, some people today believe that. And they are the false moneyers. They are the people that are looking for power. And I think it's almost always the case that people with immense power somehow convince themselves that they don't have quite enough. They just need a little more. And once they get that much, they'll be magnanimous and they'll protect the downtrodden, and they'll praise their princely realm. But of course, what will happen is the people will get just that little power that they needed, and then oddly enough, they'll need just a little more and a little more, and then, maybe a gold rush will happen or something like that. And concession after concession will be made, and then before you know it, you've totally forgotten about the people you originally thought you cared about, and you'll end up in a group of filibusters with the Star Chief. All right, and there's one other section I want to read before I get to the final section of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee that I want to read. So, this, I believe, is the Sand Creek Massacre. Is this right? Yes. So if you're not familiar with the Sand Creek Massacre, you should definitely acquaint yourself with it. This is going to be a partial description of how the Sand Creek Massacre began. So white antelope was a Cheyenne Indian who had been to Washington, or if he hadn't been to Washington, if I remember correctly, he was given an American flag as a sign of, brotherhood or closeness with the U.S. And he would fly it proudly because he saw himself as an ally and of, humanly brotherhood with the white men, as he might have said it, the white man. So then we have here, by this time, hundreds of Cheyenne women and children were gathering around Black Kettle's flag as a defense from the U.S. soldiers who were trying to massacre them. Up the dry creek bed, more were coming from White Antelope's camp. After all, had not Colonel Greenwood told Black Kettle that as long as the United States flag flew above him, no soldier would fire upon him? White Antelope, a man of 75, unarmed, his dark face seamed from sun and weather, strode toward the soldiers. He was still confident that the soldiers would stop firing as soon as they saw the American flag and the white surrender flag which Black Kettle had now run up. Medicine Calf Beckworth, riding beside Colonel Chivington, saw White Antelope approaching. He came running out to meet the command, Beckworth later testified, holding up his hands and saying, "Stop, stop." He spoke it in as plain English as I can. He stopped and folded his arms until shot down. Survivors among the Cheyenne said that White Antelope sang the death song before he died. Nothing lives long, only the earth and the mountains. And 150 Indians were killed, Cheyenne were killed in the Sand Creek Massacre, the majority being women and children, beheaded and killed in vile ways, children being shot out of their mother's arms. And, it's almost funny, I'm a teacher, so I had the students do this particular lesson related to Arthur Koestler and the Holocaust, but I asked them, what is one, topic or event that you think is underrepresented or underappreciated today that you think should be more noticed? And I had one student say that his best friend is half Cherokee and half Polish. And so he wanted to write about the mistreatment of the Indians, Native Americans. And he was asking me, because he couldn't quite remember, he said, wait, who are the people that killed the Indians again? And I said, oh, you mean U.S. soldiers? And then his face kind of got red, and he was like, what? What are you talking about? And this is a sophomore in high school. And I happened to have this book with me, so I told him about, part of the Sand Creek Massacre, and told him that was not out of the ordinary for the time. But he didn't want to think about that. He was like, wait, who did it before that? And I told him, oh, well, the Spanish really got here first with, Cortez and different people. And he was like, oh, okay, yeah, the Spanish. But it just makes me think that, I think if this stuff was widely talked about as it is in Blood Meridian, it wouldn't be quite as easy to have things go on as they have been in the United States. And I want to read one last section here from Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. This is on page 220, if you want to read along. California Indians were gentle as the climate in which they lived. The Spaniards gave them names, established missions for them, converted and debauched them. Tribal organizations were undeveloped among the California Indians. Each village had its leaders, but there were no great war chiefs among these unwarlike people. After the discovery of gold in 1848, white men from all over the world poured into California by the thousands, taking what they wanted from the submissive Indians, debasing those who the Spaniards had not already debased, and then systematically exterminating whole populations now long forgotten. No one remembers the Chilulas, the Chimaricos, Urebures, Nipewais, Alonas, or 100 other bands whose bones have been sealed under 1 million miles of freeways, parking lots, and slabs of tract housing. And, you know, I just can't help but think of what I think is the best movie I've ever seen, Koyaanisqatsi, which is a Hopi word meaning life out of balance. So, my final thought is that I think it is horrifying how destructive specifically the United States has been to the languages and the cultures and the people that lived and still live here. But unfortunately, even the people who think they agree with me ostensibly don't. Many of them. Of course, some people are way down the track from me and, helping more than the vast majority of people do. But I met a lot of fakers at my college who would think they would agree with what I'm saying of the horror of the destruction of culture. But, they might not even know about the Sand Creek Massacre, which is almost as obvious as the Wounded Knee Massacre, where 20 U.S. soldiers were given the Medal of Honor for slaughtering women and children, which totally debases the medal for any heroic event after. Like, when a U.S. soldier in World War II got the Medal of Honor for a heroic act, they would be in a group with 20 people who got the Medal of Honor for aiding in a genocide. So then what does that tell you about the honor you're getting bestowed with? And many people don't know that. Many people don't know that about Wounded Knee Massacre, even if they might have heard of that, which was in 1890. 1890. Rilke was 15 years old in 1890, as an example. James Joyce was 8 years old, for example, in 1890, when the genocide against Native Americans was still happening. And a couple of things I've been really disappointed with is the difficulty of finding resources on Native American languages, Native American culture, literature. I got that survey of the languages of Native North America, which if I bought it new, it would cost me nearly $80 for a paperback, which is a little more expensive than a throwaway novel by Stephen King or something like that. And I just wonder how many people at my university who would seemingly agree with a lot of what I said, but wouldn't even looked into a Native American language or mythology. And that's another thing I was looking into, is comparative mythology of the Americas. And there's almost none. But then if you look into Indo-European comparative mythology, there's tons, almost too much. Especially too much in the sense of these, idiotic, neo-Viking types, who probably agree with the fucking redneck neo-Nazis. But anyway, I almost didn't make this video because I know it's not really it's not enjoyable to make. I can imagine it wasn't enjoyable to watch. But I do think that there is a moral obligation to defend literature and human culture in times of its attempted destruction. And I do think, unfortunately, we are living in one of those times now. It's not as bad as other times have been, but I can easily see it getting as bad. I've been trying to do some research into the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And if something bad happens, it wouldn't surprise me if we enter another one of those situations in the United States of America. So with that fun thought, I will leave you guys, and never forget, death is a gang boss.